Strip that jacket off and shove it into a trash bag immediately, or you step out of this jet bridge right now. There are no superstar exemptions at this boarding gate." The words did not just cut through the damp morning air inside Gate 12B at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. They seemed to freeze the very gravity in the room. Not a single person in that long, winding line moved. A mother holding her young son's hand stopped mid-sentence. A man in an expensive charcoal suit lowered his briefcase to the floor without making a sound. Behind them, 24 passengers stood completely motionless, their fingers hovering over the glass of their smartphones, screens already glowing against the dim fluorescent lights. Nobody spoke because the man she was standing in front of was 6 feet and 9 inches of pure athletic royalty. He weighed 250 pounds of hardened muscle and carried himself with the heavy, unhurried grace of someone who had spent 2 decades under the blinding lights of global arenas. He was LeBron James, a name that did not require a title or an introduction in any corner of the civilized world. He had traveled millions of miles, crossed oceans on chartered flights, and walked through the most exclusive corridors on the planet. Yet here he stood, on a bitter Tuesday morning in the middle of January, being spoken to like a vagrant in an alleyway. The flight attendant standing in that doorway did not blink. Her name was Linda Vance. She was 54 years old, her uniform pressed so tightly the seams looked like knife edges, and her feet were planted wide apart like a sentry guarding a fortress. Her face carried no nervousness, no hesitation, and absolutely no respect for the stature of the man blocking her light. She looked him dead in the eyes, with a flat, cold gaze that belonged to someone who had decided long before he ever walked up that she was going to draw a line in the sand. LeBron did not roar. He did not call for his security detail or demand to speak to a corporate executive. He simply stood there, an absolute mountain of a man, and the expression that washed over his weathered face was not one of fury. It was a deep, quiet, sudden kind of hurt. He looked down at the garment clutched in his massive hands, his fingers burying themselves into the thick, heavy wool as if he were trying to shield it from her gaze. But nobody in that suffocating jet bridge knew what was actually hidden beneath the heavy green and gold fabric of that custom varsity jacket. Nobody saw the raw emotion stitched into the silk lining pressed tightly against his chest. Nobody knew who that jacket was really meant for, or the 40-year-old promise that had driven a billionaire to fly commercial on a freezing morning just to deliver it by hand. They only saw a giant holding a piece of clothing, and an airline worker who had decided that rules were more important than human dignity. But nobody in that room understood what was actually written on that faded piece of paper yet. The temperature inside the jet bridge had dropped far below the thermostat setting of the main terminal. Outside the thick plate glass windows, a bitter Chicago wind whipped across the tarmac, sending flurries of dry snow dancing around the massive tires of the Boeing 737. Inside, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit vibrating through the floorboards. The line of passengers extended backward through the glass double doors, stretching into the carpeted waiting area of Gate 12B, where the modern world usually moved in a blur of whispers and rolling luggage. Today, everything had ground to an unnatural halt. A young woman near the front of the queue slowly lowered her half-empty coffee cup, the paper sleeve crinkling slightly in her tightening grip as she stared at the confrontation. Two businessmen in identical blue overcoats exchanged a brief, uncomfortable glance before turning their eyes back to the floor, their faces flushing with the vicarious embarrassment that always accompanies a public execution of dignity. Linda Vance stood immovable in the center of the threshold, her hands resting lightly on the plastic edge of her boarding pass scanner. She had spent 22 years working the early morning domestic routes for Vanguard Airlines, a regional carrier known more for its rigid adherence to baggage fees than its passenger comfort. To Linda, the terminal was not a place of human travel or emotional departures. It was a grid of strict parameters, weight limitations, and corporate directives that had to be enforced with absolute precision. She had memorized every paragraph of the operational manual, treating the printed clauses not as guidelines, but as a shield against the chaotic unpredictability of the traveling public. Beside her, a small desktop clock on the gate counter ticked forward with cold indifference, the digital numbers shifting from 6:14 a.m. to 6:15 a.m. The flight was already 4 minutes behind its scheduled pushback time, and to an agent whose monthly performance bonus was tied directly to on-time departures, those 4 minutes felt like an eternity. She did not see the man standing before her as an icon or a person of flesh and blood. She saw him as an oversized obstacle, a disruption to her flawless logistical matrix, and a walking violation of the carry-on dimensions stipulated on the back of every paper ticket. LeBron looked down at the heavy wool clutched in his hands, his thumbs tracing the rough, raised edges of the embroidered letters on the sleeve. The deep forest, green and faded gold fabric felt warm against his palms, a sharp contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the terminal. This was not a piece of luxury fashion bought off a boutique rack in Los Angeles or Paris. It was an artifact, a heavy ghost from a past, that most people in this airport could not begin to comprehend. The weight of the jacket in his arms instantly pulled his mind backward, far away from the buzzing neon lights of Gate 12B, down through 35 years of memory to a freezing December night in Akron, Ohio. He could almost smell the familiar, comforting scent of old paper, floor wax, and damp wool that always hung low inside the basement of the St. Jude Community Library. He had been 8 years old that winter, a skinny kid with frayed sneakers and holes in his socks, standing on the street corner because the heat in his mother's apartment had been shut off again. His hands had been so numb he could not even curl his fingers into a fist. An old man named Silas Warren had been the chief librarian there for nearly 40 years. Silas was a tall, quiet man with silver hair and skin the color of polished mahogany, who wore tweed vests and never raised his voice, even when the neighborhood kids got loud near the back shelves. That winter, Silas had broken every city ordinance in the book, quietly unlocking the back door of the library at 5 o'clock every evening after the facility had officially closed for the night. He would usher the young, shivering boy inside, lead him to the radiator in the back corner, and hand him a mug of warm tea with 2 sugars. Silas never asked LeBron why he was there, and he never made him feel like a charity case. He simply pointed toward the biographies section and told him that as long as he was reading, he was allowed to take up as much space in that building as he needed. On the night before LeBron left Ohio to enter the national spotlight, Silas had handed him a faded, handwritten note that the boy had carried inside his playbook for 20 years. Silas had passed away 3 winters ago in a cold apartment, his pension eaten away by medical bills, leaving behind nothing but boxes of old books and a legacy of quiet kindness that nobody else remembered. LeBron had spent 6 months tracking down a master tailor in Chicago to recreate the exact varsity jacket Silas had worn during those long library winters, utilizing the traditional green and gold colors of the community center. The interior silk lining had been meticulously thewed by an elderly woman on the south side of Chicago who spent 3 nights working under a single lamp to get the script perfect. She had stitched 3 distinct elements into the fabric: the name Silas Warren, the phrase "just a kid from Akron," and a tiny pocket containing the original library card from 1992. LeBron had chosen to carry the heavy garment over his arm because he knew the rigid luggage bins would crush the delicate hand-pressed stitching before it could ever reach Silas's surviving sister. He had walked up to the boarding gate carrying a debt of gratitude that had taken a lifetime to pay back. Linda Vance took a step forward, her black leather uniform shoes clicking sharply against the metal transition strip of the doorway. Her jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line that signaled to everyone in the jet bridge that the window for negotiation had officially closed. She pointed a manicured finger toward a large, silver metal luggage sizer that stood against the wall of the gate area, its cold bars scratched and dented from thousands of forced bags. "You need to drop that garment into the test slot right now, sir," Linda said, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of chilling authority. "If the fabric exceeds the standard 4-inch depth requirement for personal items, it goes underneath the plane in a cargo hold, or you do not step foot on this aircraft. I will not jeopardize the emergency evacuation integrity of Vanguard Flight 942 because an individual feels their personal wardrobe deserves a special set of rules." The silence that followed her statement was heavy and absolute. LeBron stood entirely still, his massive shoulders blocking the light from the terminal behind him, making him look like a dark monument trapped in a narrow corridor. He did not raise his hand or change the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, but his fingers tightened around the wool jacket, pulling it closer to his chest as if he were trying to protect a child from a sudden storm. The quiet dignity of his posture did not soften her expression. It seemed to infuriate her further, pushing her chin higher as she realized the entire line was watching her demand a global icon submit to her authority. Behind them, the crowd had begun to ripple with an uncomfortable, toxic energy that always accompanies a public humiliation. The young mother pulled her son back against her legs, her eyes darting between Linda's cold face and the large green and gold jacket with an expression of deep discomfort. A few feet back, a group of college students slowly lifted their phones to chest height, the black camera lenses reflecting the dim overhead lights as they began recording the scene. Nobody stepped forward to speak for him, and nobody tried to break the tension, leaving the man completely isolated in the center of the narrow walkway while the cold wind continued to rattle the glass panels beside them. A tall, white-haired man in a crisp Vanguard captain's uniform moved through the forward galley of the aircraft and stepped onto the jet bridge with a slow, deliberate stride. His face was weathered from 34 years of navigating transcontinental corridors, his silver hair catching the sharp glare of the safety lights as he came to a stop just behind Linda's left shoulder. His name was Captain Thomas Vance, no relation to Linda, though they had shared this specific early morning rotation for nearly 7 months. His eyes did not drift to the massive stature of LeBron James or the glowing screens of the smartphones held by the passengers in the queue. Instead, his gaze fell directly upon Linda's hand, which was still pointing aggressively toward the metal luggage sizer. "Stand down, Linda," Captain Vance said, his voice carrying the low, resonant calm of an instrument calibrated to survive a violent storm. "You are relieved from this boarding gate, effective immediately. Step back inside the terminal cabin and report to the operations duty manager on the 4th floor." Linda turned sharply, her face turning a deep, blotchy crimson as she stared at the pilot in absolute disbelief. "Captain, this individual is in direct violation of the carry-on density restrictions outlined in Section 4 of our safety manual," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mix of intense frustration and corporate pride. "I am simply enforcing the company policy to ensure the cabin remains secure for departure." "I know exactly what you are doing, Linda," Captain Vance said, his eyes narrowing into a hard, steady stare that cut through her defense like a blade. "And I know exactly what is written in the incident logs from last autumn. You will leave your scanner on the counter and walk away from this gate before I have the airport police escort you out of my sight." Linda Vance froze, her hand dropping from the boarding pass scanner as if the plastic had suddenly turned to ice. The crimson flush on her cheeks deepened, spreading down her neck and disappearing into the stiff collar of her blue uniform blouse. She looked at the silver-haired pilot, her lips parting to offer another policy citation, but the absolute stillness in Captain Vance's eyes stopped the words cold in her throat. The heavy silence of the jet bridge returned, pressing against everyone's ears as the crowd watched the invisible power dynamic shift completely in the span of 3 seconds. Captain Vance reached into the right breast pocket of his leather flight jacket and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of paper. He did not hand it to her. He simply held it between his fingers, the white edge of the document standing out sharply against the dark leather of his uniform. This paper had been sitting inside a manila envelope at the bottom of his leather flight bag for exactly 4 months, traveling with him across 40,000 miles of airspace, while he quietly watched a pattern complete itself. I checked the Vanguard crew logs before I signed our departure manifest. This morning, Linda, Captain Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, conversational whisper that somehow carried to the very back of the passenger line. I wanted to see if the name on my gate sheet matched the name from an incident report filed in Atlanta last September. A young man named Marcus Taylor, 24 years old, was flying to a medical residency interview with nothing but a heavy woolen winter coat his grandfather had worn in Korea. You stopped him at the threshold of Gate 4C, claimed the coat was an obstruction, and forced him to check his only bag for $45 when he had less than $20 in his account. He missed his connection, he missed his interview, and he spent the night on the linoleum floor of the terminal because you'd decided that a strict interpretation of weight metrics gave you the right to strip away a young man's future. Linda's eyes darted down to the paper in his hand, her fingers twitching against her sides as a cold bead of sweat rolled down her temple. That was an administrative clearance issue, she muttered, her voice losing its sharp authority and descending into a defensive, hurried rasp. The baggage dimensions were outside the standard cabin parameters for a regional flight. It wasn't a dimension issue, Linda. It was a human issue, Captain Vance said, his voice remaining perfectly steady, perfectly cold. You didn't see a young doctor trying to change his life that morning. Just like you don't see the history stitched into the lining of this jacket today. You only see a boundary line that allows you to feel powerful by making someone else feel small. Now step away from my door. Linda Vance took 2 slow steps backward, her black leather uniform shoes scraping against the floor as if she had suddenly forgotten how to lift her feet. The authority that had sustained her through 22 years of corporate enforcement seemed to drain from her in an instant, leaving her shoulders slumped and her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her personal belongings on the counter. She did not look at Captain Vance, and she did not dare to raise her eyes to the long line of passengers who were now watching her retreat with an absolute, breathless silence. She turned and walked out of the jet bridge, stepping through the glass double doors and back into the main terminal area of Gate 12B. Her face was entirely pale now, the previous crimson flush replaced by a cold, hollow expression that spoke of a sudden and catastrophic realization of error. A few feet away, a group of travelers looked up from their screens as she passed, their eyes tracking the movement of her blue lanyard as it swung limply against her chest. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on the gray carpet beneath her feet, moving toward the employee elevator with the hurried, uneven steps of someone who felt the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes pressing against her back. By the time the elevator doors closed behind her, the 11-second video recorded by the college students had already climbed to the top of the local aviation threads. The caption did not mention her years of perfect attendance or her knowledge of the safety manuals. It simply stated that a Vanguard agent had tried to humiliate a legend and had her career ended on the spot. Within 90 minutes, the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Airlines in Dallas had issued a brief two-sentence press release, indicating that they were aware of the gate exchange and had placed the employee on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal review. The digital world did not care about the context of her life or the quiet suburb where she went home to her garden every evening. They only saw a uniform that had chosen to stand in the way of a beautiful human moment, turning her worst public seconds into a permanent monument of internet outrage. Linda sat in a quiet break room on the fourth floor, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her head as she stared at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, finally realizing that the rules she had used to protect herself had become the very cage that would define her downfall. 6 weeks after the bitter winter morning at Gate 12B, the intense noise of the digital world began to settle into a quiet, reflective stillness. The viral videos had been replaced by newer trends, the hashtags had faded from the top lists, and the main terminal of Chicago O'Hare moved forward with its usual rhythm of departures and arrivals. Inside a small, gray-walled training room at Vanguard Airlines Corporate Training Center in Des Moines, Iowa, Linda Vance sat at a long wooden table with a manual open before her. This was not the standard operations manual filled with weight limitations and luggage dimensions, but a specialized course curriculum focusing on human empathy, cultural awareness, and emotional intelligence in passenger service. She looked different without the crisp, pressed uniform and the silver Vanguard lanyard that had defined her identity for over 2 decades. She wore a simple charcoal sweater, her silver hair pulled back into a soft clip, and her eyes carried a quiet, subdued quality that had replaced the sharp, unyielding certainty of her past. Every morning for 3 weeks, she had listened to stories of ordinary passengers who traveled through airports carrying invisible burdens, grieving parents, anxious first-time flyers, and young students trying to reach life-changing interviews with nothing but a frayed coat and hope. For the first time in her career, Linda began to understand that a boarding gate was not a border control checkpoint to be defended, but a bridge where human lives intersected in moments of deep vulnerability. The turning point had occurred on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the instructor played a quiet audio clip of an interview with a young logistics coordinator named Marcus Taylor. Marcus spoke without anger or resentment, describing how a missed connection in Atlanta had initially broken his spirit, but how a senior pilot's quiet intervention months later had completely restored his belief in human kindness. Linda had sat in the back row of the dim room, her hand pressed against her trembling lips as she listened to the tremor in the young man's voice, finally seeing the real flesh-and-blood consequence of her rigid adherence to power. She did not try to defend her past decisions or point to the safety sub-clauses in her old files. She simply let the weight of the truth sink into her chest, realizing that true safeties in aviation began with respecting the dignity of the passengers boarding the aircraft. By the time she completed the mandatory program in late March, Linda was offered a reassignment to quiet, domestic regional routes operating out of a smaller secondary hub in Omaha, Nebraska. She accepted the position without hesitation or complaint, stepping onto the terminal floor not as an enforcer of strict corporate boundaries, but as a woman who had learned the hard way that compassion was the ultimate rule. On her very first morning back at work, an elderly woman approached her desk, carrying a large, hand-woven basket wrapped in thick wool blankets that exceeded the standard personal item dimensions. Linda did not reach for her luggage sizer or quote the baggage penalty fees. She simply looked at the woman's anxious expression, gave a gentle, reassuring smile, and quietly helped her secure the item in the forward coat closet where it would remain safe for the entire flight. On a quiet afternoon in early April, The cold winter winds of Ohio had finally given way to the soft, golden light of early spring. Inside the newly renovated reading room of the St. Jude Community Library in Akron, a 65-year-old retired librarian named Anthony Owens sat in his favorite leather armchair by the window. His weathered face was illuminated by the sun, his fingers gently running over the pristine surface of a heavy green and gold varsity jacket that rested across his lap. He did not say a word as he stared at the meticulous embroidery on the sleeve, but a single tear slipped down his cheek, catching the light before disappearing into the thick wool fabric. He turned the jacket over, his trembling hands pulling back the silk lining to reveal the hand-stitched words that had been pressed against LeBron's chest during that chaotic morning in Chicago. The gold script was perfectly clear: Silas Warren, just a kid from Akron. Gui Mr. Anthony, ngui da zu chachik bom komot vit vua, chuk he na keep lun len. Inside the tiny interior pocket, the original library card from 1992 sat safely in its seam, a permanent anchor linking a billionaire's global legacy back to a cold library basement where an ordinary man had once chosen to show extraordinary kindness to a shivering child. LeBron James had posted a quiet, 4-minute video to his personal account 6 days after the incident at Gate 12B, speaking without any studio lights or public relations scripts from the back of a moving car. He had not mentioned Linda Vance by name, nor had he called for anger or corporate retaliation against the airline worker who had blocked his path. He simply held the varsity jacket up to the camera, explained the history of Silas Warren, and reminded 41 million viewers that human dignity is never something that can be measured by a corporate rulebook or a luggage sizer. The story was never about a piece of clothing or a superstar exemption at a boarding gate. It was about a pattern of quiet courage carried inside a pilot's leather bag, a young doctor who finally got his second chance at a first impression, and an old librarian who reminded the world that we all deserve to take up space.